For more than 70 years, Australia ran one of the most openly racial immigration systems in the Western world. From the moment the country federated in 1901, the new national government made it clear that Australia was to be a white, preferably British nation. The Immigration Restriction Act of that year created the famous dictation test, a 50-word passage that could be given in any European language the immigration officer chose. If you weren't the kind of person they wanted, they simply picked a language you didn't know. The test was almost never failed by the people it was designed to keep out, because those people rarely even got the chance to sit it. Shipping companies simply stopped selling tickets to anyone likely to be rejected. The result was dramatic. By the late 1940s, people of Asian descent made up less than 1/4% of the population. That policy wasn't some secret. It was popular. It had strong support across the political spectrum, from the Labour Party and the unions to the Conservatives. Australians at the time genuinely believed that racial homogeneity was essential for social cohesion, high living standards, and national security. Fear of cheap Asian labor undercutting white wages, anxiety about Japan's rising power, and a deep cultural preference for British stock all mixed together into a powerful national consensus. So what changed? The first cracks appeared after the Second World War. Australia had just faced the very real possibility of invasion. The country was vast, underpopulated, and suddenly aware of how vulnerable it was. The new immigration minister, Arthur Calwell, summed it up with the slogan that defined the era: populate or perish. The problem was that not enough British people wanted to come. The famous 10-pound palm scheme helped, but it wasn't enough, so the government began quietly widening the net, first to Northern Europeans, then Southern Europeans, then refugees from the Baltic states. Even then, the racial hierarchy remained. Non-Europeans were still heavily restricted, but the world outside Australia was changing fast. Decolonization was sweeping Asia and Africa. The United Nations was talking about racial equality. Australia's nearest neighbors were no longer European colonies. They were independent nations watching how Australia treated people who looked like them. The Colombo Plan brought thousands of Asian students to Australian universities in the 1950s. Many of those students went home and became leaders in their own countries, carrying memories of Australian hospitality and Australian exclusion. International criticism started to bite. Australia looked increasingly out of step with the post-war world it claimed to be part of. Inside the country, attitudes were shifting too, especially among younger people and the better educated. The old certainties about race were starting to look outdated. Cases like the attempted deportation of mixed-race families or Japanese war brides created public controversy and forced politicians to confront the human cost of the policy. In 1949, when the Liberal Country Party government came in, Immigration Minister Harold Holt allowed several hundred non-European refugees to stay and began admitting Japanese war brides. It was a small step, but it signaled that the absolute racial bar was no longer sacred. Through the 1950s, the rules kept easing. Non-Europeans who had lived in Australia for 15 years could apply for citizenship. The infamous dictation test was abolished in 1958. Still, the numbers of non-European migrants remained tiny, and race was still the deciding factor. The real turning point came in 1966 under Prime Minister Harold Holt. After a review of the policy, Immigration Minister Hubert Opperman announced that applications would now be accepted from well-qualified people of any background, judged on their ability to integrate and the skills they brought, not on their race. The waiting period for citizenship was made the same for everyone. Non-European migration numbers began to rise, slowly at first, then more noticeably. This was the watershed moment. From that point on, the White Australia policy was effectively dead in practice, even if the phrase still hung around in people's minds. Why did the Holt government do it? Partly it was principle. Partly it was pragmatism. Australia needed skilled migrants. It needed better relations with Asia for trade and strategic reasons during the Cold War. And it was becoming embarrassing. Continuing an openly racial policy was damaging Australia's international standing at a time when the country wanted to be taken seriously as a modern, independent nation in the Asia Pacific. Even then, it took another 7 years to finish the job. In 1972, Gough Whitlam's Labour government came to power with a clear commitment to remove the last traces of racial discrimination from immigration. In 1973, the government made citizenship available to all permanent residents after 3 years, regardless of origin, and issued instructions that race was to be completely disregarded in migrant selection. Immigration Minister Al Grassby, visiting the Philippines that year, was asked about the White Australia policy. His reply became famous. "The White Australia policy is dead. Give me a shovel and I will bury it." 2 years later, the Racial Discrimination Act made it unlawful to discriminate on the grounds of race, color, or ethnic origin. That was the final legal nail in the coffin. So why did it end? It wasn't one dramatic moment or one heroic politician. It was a slow, sometimes reluctant process, driven by a combination of forces: the need for population after the war, the failure to attract enough British migrants, changing international norms, and the desire not to be seen as a racist backwater, growing economic and strategic interest in Asia, shifting public attitudes inside Australia, especially among the post-war generation, and the quiet persistence of reformers in both major parties who recognized that the old policy no longer served the national interest. What's striking is how gradual and relatively low drama the change was. There was no single referendum, no massive protest movement that forced the government's hand overnight. Support for the old policy had been soft for years before the final steps were taken. By the time Whitlam buried it, most Australians had already accepted that the world and Australia's place in it had changed. The end of the White Australia policy didn't instantly create the multicultural Australia we know today. That took decades of further migration, policy, and social adjustment, but it removed the legal and official barrier that had defined the country for most of the 20th century. From a nation that deliberately tried to stay white and British, Australia became a country that, at least in principle, selected people on the basis of what they could contribute rather than where they came from or what they looked like. That shift is one of the most consequential in our history, and it happened not because Australians suddenly became saints, but because the old policy stopped making sense in a changing world.